In December 2025, the President of the United States stood beside a rendering of a warship that does not exist and announced that America would build battleships again. Not destroyers, not cruisers, battleships. A type of warship the United States Navy retired more than 3 decades ago, a type most naval planners had quietly filed away as extinct. 8 months later, in August 2026, the Congressional Budget Office attached a number to that promise: $23.4 billion for the first ship alone. If that estimate holds, this single vessel is projected to become the most expensive warship ever built, roughly $10 billion beyond the aircraft carrier that currently holds the record. And the ship has not even been ordered yet. This is the story of why the battleship disappeared, why Washington wants it back, and why the price began climbing before a single plate of steel was cut. To understand how strange this moment is, start with the last time America commissioned a battleship. On June 11, 1944, the USS Missouri entered service at the New York Navy Yard. She was an Iowa-class ship, 45,000 tons of armored steel, her main battery, 9 16-inch guns, each capable of throwing a shell weighing 2,700 pounds about 23 miles. 15 months after her commissioning, the Second World War ended on her deck, when Japanese officials signed the surrender documents in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The Missouri was the last battleship the United States Navy ever commissioned, not the last one it used. After providing gunfire support in the Korean War, she was mothballed in 1955, and that could have been the end. Instead, all 4 Iowa-class ships returned to service in the 1980s, modernized with Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Missouri, recommissioned in May 1986, sailed a cruise around the world and fired those Tomahawks in combat during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, nearly half a century after her launch. But on March 31, 1992, she was decommissioned for the final time. Since 1998, she has rested at Pearl Harbor as a museum ship, moored within sight of the sunken Arizona. With her retirement, the battleship era formally ended. It ended for 2 reasons, and both were technological. The first was the aircraft carrier. A carrier's air wing could find and strike targets hundreds of miles away, far beyond the horizon that limited even the largest naval gun. The second was the guided missile. Once a small ship, an aircraft, or a submarine could deliver a precision warhead across enormous distances, thick armor and giant rifles stopped being the currency of naval power. The battleship's defining features became its greatest liabilities: enormous crews, enormous fuel bills, and a mission that smaller, cheaper ships could perform better. So for more than 30 years, the word battleship belonged to museums and history books. Then, on December 22, 2025, at Mar-a-Lago, the announcement came. A new class of American battleships, promoted in the President's words as the fastest, the biggest, and far more powerful than any battleship ever built. The pitch went beyond the ship itself. The program was framed as a way to revive the American shipbuilding industry and to intimidate adversaries through sheer visible power. The Navy's designation tells you what it actually is: BBGN, a nuclear-powered guided missile battleship. The lead ship is to be named USS Defiant, and the class is planned as the centerpiece of a new fleet blueprint of surface combatants, support ships, and unmanned vessels released in May 2026 as the Navy's shipbuilding plan for fiscal year 2027, known as the Golden Fleet Plan. The published specifications describe a ship unlike anything on the water today, full load displacement around 35,000 tons. That would make the Defiant the largest surface combatant in the world and the largest surface combatant built for the U.S. Navy since the Second World War. more than 3.5 times the size of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and more than twice the size of the stealth destroyer Zumwalt. The announced armament reads like a wish list from a naval research lab: 128 vertical launch cells for anti-ship, anti-air, and land attack missiles, launch tubes for hypersonic conventional prompt strike weapons, an electromagnetic railgun, large shipboard lasers, a scaled-up version of the SPY-6 air and missile defense radar, and provisions to carry nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles. Notice what is missing from that list: guns as the main battery. This is a battleship in name and in size, not in armament philosophy. The 16-inch rifles that define the Missouri belong to a different century. What the name is meant to signal is mass, presence, and magazine depth, one enormous hull carrying more firepower than an entire group of smaller warships. Whether that logic holds in an age of hypersonic anti-ship missiles is one of the central questions hanging over this program. What do you think a ship like this is really for, deterrence or actual fighting? Keep that question in mind because the price tag makes it sharper. Because the price is where this story turns. In its budget submission to Congress, the Navy itself estimated the lead ship at $15.1 billion. Pause on that number, because even the Navy's own opening bid would have shattered the record for the most expensive warship in history. Early planning figures told the same story. Initial estimates for the first 3 ships totaled $43.5 billion, with the lead ship alone projected to exceed $17 billion. Then in January 2026, the Congressional Budget Office ran an early independent estimate and concluded the first ship could cost up to roughly $20.6 billion if ordered immediately, with cost expected to rise over time. Notice the direction of travel: 15 billion, 17 billion, 20 billion. Each new look at the same ship found a bigger number, and then came the decision that pushed the number higher still. The original concept called for conventional propulsion, gas turbines like those on cruisers and destroyers. Senior Navy officials had said earlier in the year that a nuclear-powered battleship would take too long and cost too much. The May 2026 shipbuilding plan overruled that caution. The class would be nuclear-powered after all. In August 2026, the CBO published its full assessment. The first BBGN, ordered in 2028, would cost $23.4 billion in 2026 dollars. Nuclear power alone makes the 15-ship program about 13% more expensive than a conventionally powered version, in exchange for eliminating fuel purchases across the life of the fleet. To grasp what $23.4 billion means for one hull, you need the current record holder. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, closed out at a final procurement cost of $13,316.5 million, or about $13.3 billion, according to the Congressional Research Service. That is a nuclear supercarrier weighing 100,000 tons, the most expensive warship ever completed. The first battleship is now projected to cost roughly $10 billion more than that, for a ship 1/3 the carrier's size. One maritime analysis put it in even starker terms. The Defiant would cost about as much as a Ford-class carrier and a ballistic missile submarine combined, the 2 most expensive vessel types the Navy has ever produced. And the Defiant is only the beginning. The plan calls for 15 battleships ordered between 2028 and 2056, roughly one every other year for nearly 3 decades. Follow-on ships are estimated at slightly more than $18 billion each, once design costs are behind the program and shipyards settle into a rhythm. The total program cost comes to about $275 billion in 2026 dollars. The administration has spoken of an eventual fleet of 20 to 25 ships, and a Senate Budget Committee estimate priced a 25-ship fleet at as much as $455 billion. Already, the battleship is reshaping the Navy's checkbook. The procurement budget for surface combatants is set to climb from about $11 billion in 2025 to $18 billion by 2027, driven by these hulls. For comparison, $23.4 billion for one ship is more than many countries spend on their entire armed forces in a year. Would you rather have one battleship or an entire navy of smaller ships for the same money? That is exactly the argument now playing out in Washington. If you are finding this breakdown useful, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, because the next part of the story is the one the price tag does not show: whether American shipyards can build these ships at all. The CBO's warning on this point is direct. Under the new plan, the total tonnage of large surface combatants the industry must produce would need to grow by 60%. Even as the Navy continues building 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers every year alongside a battleship every other year, the yards in question are the same ones that build the Navy's surface combatants and amphibious ships today: Bath Iron Works in Maine and Ingalls Shipbuilding on the Gulf Coast, an industrial base that already struggles with delays on destroyers, frigates, and submarines, would have to deliver the largest surface combatants since the 1940s on a steady drumbeat for 30 years, in docks and hulls never sized for ships of this displacement. The plan also carries a quiet casualty. The DDG-X, the next-generation destroyer the Navy had been designing for years, is now expected to be shelved in favor of the battleship. And here the Navy's own recent history casts a long shadow, because this is not the first time it has bet on a revolutionary surface combatant loaded with unproven technology. In the 1990s, the Navy set out to build 32 stealth destroyers of what became the Zumwalt class. Costs climbed, and the class shrank from 32 ships to 24 to 7, and finally to 3. The Government Accountability Office put the cost of those 3 ships, including research and development, at roughly $24.5 billion. Nearly the price of the first battleship, spent on a class that never found its mission. The details are worse than the totals. The Zumwalt was built around 2 advanced 155mm gun systems designed to fire precision-guided shells about 80 miles. When the class collapsed to 3 ships, the production run for that ammunition collapsed with it, and the price per shell rose to between $800,000 and $1 million more than a cruise missile. The Navy canceled the ammunition program in 2016, and the most advanced naval guns ever mounted on a warship have never fired in service. The ships are now being rebuilt to carry hypersonic missiles instead. And the railgun, the weapon that features on the battleship's announced spec sheet, the Navy already tried it. After more than a decade of development, the service zeroed out its railgun funding in its 2022 budget request in mid-2021 without ever fielding the weapon at sea. That history explains why analysts read the battleship's weapons list with raised eyebrows. Nearly every headline system on the Defiant, the railgun, the shipboard lasers, the hypersonic launchers sits somewhere between unproven and previously canceled. The 128 missile cells and the SPY-6 radar are mature technology. The rest is a wager that this time, unlike last time, the exotic systems will arrive on schedule and on budget aboard the most expensive hull ever ordered. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the Zumwalt story repeated itself on a $23 billion ship, what would that mean for the rest of the fleet? To be fair to the battleship's advocates, the case for it is not irrational. The Pacific is vast, and Chinese shipyards are producing warships at a pace American yards cannot currently match. A nuclear-powered ship with 128 missile cells never needs to refuel and carries deeper magazines than any surface combatant in the fleet today. Aircraft carriers face growing threats from long-range anti-ship missiles, and spreading firepower across more large hulls complicates an adversary's targeting problem. Presence matters too. A 35,000-ton warship anchored off a coastline sends a message that a destroyer does not. The Golden Fleet plan is, at its core, a bet that visible mass still deters. The timeline now runs like this. The contract for the USS Defiant is planned for 2028. Construction of a first-in-class nuclear surface combatant is expected to take 8 years or longer, with delivery targeted for the mid-2030s. Somewhere on the American coast, in a building dock originally sized for destroyers, workers would assemble the first American battleship in roughly 90 years. In June 1944, the Missouri joined the fleet as the most powerful expression of American naval force, and within a decade, her kind was heading for obsolescence. In the 2030s, the Defiant may join the fleet as the most expensive expression of it, projected to hold that record before her keel is even laid. The open question is which ancestor she takes after: the Missouri, which outlived every prediction of her irrelevance and served across 5 decades, or the Zumwalt, a revolution that shrank to a footnote. The CBO has already told us what the ship will cost. What no report can tell us yet is what she will be worth. Which future do you think is more likely, the heir to the Missouri or the sequel to the Zumwalt? Tell me in the comments, and while you are down there, tell me which warship you would want covered next.